Hi. What went right with the Gaza war and what went wrong with the Gaza war? What in fact happened and what lessons can we learn? That's what I want to talk about in today's video. Now, as those of you who have been following this channel know, I've already made a few videos in which I've tried to think through the Gaza war by applying some of the various principles of military strategy that I know at least. And I put links to those videos, by the way, in the description in case you want to watch them. I've also written about the topic on my Substack. Again, I put links in the description to those articles. Now, I am an unabashed Israel supporter, but I've also been very critical of what I perceive to be the Israel's apparent lack of thinking about strategy and doctrine. And I've long suspected that the IDF, because it's so good at tactics, mistakes tactics for strategy. And then, of course, there's the IDF's love affair with technology, which causes other problems. Now, as an analyst, though, there's this big problem that I've had, which is that it's been really hard to know what actually the IDF was doing in Gaza and how it conducted the war. Press reporting falls short, to say the very least, which is why I'm delighted to have on this channel today one of the few civilians who knows a great deal about the IDF and the Gaza war, Seth Frantzman. Seth is an Israel-based journalist who's been covering the IDF and Israeli military operations for, I don't know, maybe a decade, I'm not sure. And often he's been embedded with IDF units. Now, this past July, Seth published an excellent book in which he recounted much of what he knows, saw, and heard, called The October 7 War, Israel's Battle for Security in Gaza. Much of the meat of the book actually comes from Seth's time embedded with IDF units in Gaza and elsewhere during the war. I recommend the book highly, and I believe at the very least that the book is going to have a long shelf life as part of the historical record of the war because of all the details in it and because of the pertinence of his observations. If you'd like to purchase the book, and I really think you should, I put a link to the book in the description and also in the comments below. Now, speaking of descriptions and comments, please do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe if you have not already. It really helps my channel. Now, before I say anything else, I'd love to turn this over to you, Seth, to introduce yourself. Who are you and what do you do?
Well, thank you so much for having me on. Well, who am I? I was born in Maine, in the United States, and I moved to Israel in 2024. Before doing that, I received a bachelor's degree at the University of Arizona. I studied actually Middle East studies, a bit of Slavic studies, and also some concentration on U.S. foreign policy. And I studied abroad a bit. Actually, studied in Russia for a summer, and I spent some time in Mexico and other places. So I had some foreign experience, and I actually thought about going to the U.S. Foreign Service before moving to Israel to do a master's and PhD. Through working on the master's and PhD, I ended up working kind of as a side job in journalism, and because I got to spend a lot of time in the West Bank. I was actually teaching at some point at a Palestinian university, so I started covering a lot of these topics, and then that kind of got me into doing journalism and some think tank work and analyst work, but more full time, so that I was kind of wearing several hats. And I wrote a book about the war in ISIS. I wrote a book about drone warfare. And then when the October 7th war started, I found myself immediately going down to the border of Gaza on October 7th, 2023. And I covered the war, I guess almost daily for, I don't know, 12 or 15 months, including, as you noted, spending time with a lot of the IDF units in Gaza, on the border of Gaza, interviewing commanders and soldiers as they went in and out and things like that. And the book is the result of that.
By the way, did you say you moved in 2024?
Sorry, 2004. Yeah, I get confused.
Okay.
2020, 2004. So it's been 21 years here in Israel.
Okay, thank you.
So,
That makes more
right.
sense than 2024. Seth, I thought really the easiest thing to do is just to talk about your book and a lot of the stuff that's in your book, which I read recently, and I think it's excellent and it's very stimulating. Now, the book paints, among other things, it paints a very grim picture of unpreparedness. So I wanted to talk about that. Why was Israel so unprepared for this war? Why didn't it see it coming? And where was its head?
Well, I think Israel, if you go back to that era of October 2023, certainly, Israel didn't think that there would be a conflict in Gaza. If anything, they thought there might be, a short round of fighting the way there had been many times before. And it's important to understand, if we go back to the era of the Second Intifada, so around 2000 to 2005, the big thing for Israel was focusing on the Palestinians and the fighting against the Palestinians. But things began to transition once Israel left Gaza and Hamas took over Gaza. The view, I think, was that, having Hamas in Gaza kind of allows it to be contained. So Israel built, more and more defenses around the Gaza Strip, and Israel fought numerous wars against Hamas in 2009, 12, 2014, 18 or 17, there was some flare-ups, and then 2021. And if you read the reports from the IDF coming out of all those conflicts, Israel felt that it had won each of those rounds, and set each time it won, it thought it set Hamas back years, and then obviously it didn't. But Israel definitely felt that it had the defenses to keep Hamas in check. It had a high-tech security fence. It thought it had defeated the tunnel threat underground. It thought that it had all the technology you'd need to stop any kind of, attacks. It thought it had the Iron Dome and all the air defenses. And so the sense in Israel's security establishment was Gaza doesn't really matter. It's like 1% or 5% of what, in terms of our attention span. We need to spend 99% of our time or 90% of our time looking at the Iranian proxy threat and the Iranian threat in terms of Hezbollah and Iranian proxies in Iraq and Syria, Iran itself, which Israel calls the third circle threat. So Israel was focused on this campaign in Syria to stop the Iranians from moving weapons to Hezbollah. And Israel was convinced that that was working. And Israel was pretty scared or worried that the Hezbollah was, it would pose a much larger threat because it had 200,000 rockets or something. And Israel was worried it had precision-guided munitions that could, lay waste airports or whatever. So the sense was that Gaza just didn't matter. And I think when we look at military history, there's lots of times when, you have massive military blunders or countries underestimate their opponents and they get taken by surprise, whether it's the Pearl Harbor attack or Operation Barbarossa or the Tet Offensive. And maybe October 7th is best compared to something like the Tet Offensive in 1968, where U.S. troops in Vietnam, with all the intelligence technology that they had, did not catch wind of the Viet Cong and Northern Vietnamese army, moving massive amounts of men into position to attack most of the cities in South Vietnam. I mean, how could you not notice that, right? I mean, and yet it was not noticed. So, and then those were human wave assaults, which is the same as October 7th. It was, because at the end of the day, what overwhelmed Israel on the border was not Hamas technology. It was just masses of men. It was like 3,000 or 4,000 men attacking, an Israeli defensive line of 30 miles or something that had, I think, 400, 500 combat soldiers. I mean, the odds were just not, it doesn't matter how good your technology is, the odds were not there in Israel's favor. And disaster was a result. I mean, a massive military, but more than that, a civilian disaster.
I believe in your book you mentioned there was one of those Merkava tanks that was captured during the Hamas attack on 7 October where the gun was wrapped in plastic, like it wasn't even operable. So like the tank crew could not have even fought off attackers.
I think the gun was wrapped in plastic just because it was probably getting towards winter or something. I think that it was operable. I think they could take it off. It just shows that they didn't. I mean, they probably didn't think they'd ever need to use the tank's main gun. I mean, against Gaza, right? I mean, and these guys were there once the mortars and rockets started coming in the morning. They probably got on the tank, but the tank has machine guns and other weapon systems. So I assume they just never imagined they would need the gun. They might not need it. I mean, at the end of the day, the gun wasn't going to help them against swarms of men on motorcycles. Tanks don't actually do a very good job against that. But I guess the main machine gun or whatever would have. I mean, I think the guys were just totally overwhelmed. And there were two tanks there. I think one of them, I can't remember, both of them were overwhelmed by the attack. But anyway, the guys were kidnapped. The bodies were kidnapped into Gaza. I think and bit by bit, I think Israel has said that several of them they think are dead, or it's not entirely clear. One of those guys, I think, was an American, Omer Nutra. His family spoke, I believe, at one of the conventions, actually. So those people, Israel views everyone that was taken into Gaza, dead or alive, as hostages. So in those people are supposed to be released in some phase of the deal, I think.
One of the interesting things about your book is that you highlighted some really impressive technology as well as some tactics. Can you describe some of the things that you saw that worked well or that you thought was particularly impressive?
Well, I think that, Israel has tried to harness, all the different types of technology that are kind of trickling down to lower level platoons and battalion level soldiers. So what that means, for instance, is you have units. One of them is called the Sky Riders, which uses these drones that you launch with a kind of giant slingshot,
Hmm.
and those drones are actually help the artillery in terms of spotting in real time solutions. So, you have an artillery unit out there that can see and kind of in real time what they're hitting or what they're not hitting correctly, using shells that are even more precise than in the past, right? So, it's all about taking all the types of tools that armies have had for hundreds of years. I mean, artillery is not something new, but I mean, we all know that historically the way you use artillery is you try to soften up an enemy by firing massive amounts of them, and usually it doesn't succeed at all. Actually, I mean, look at what happened in the Battle of Gettysburg. The Confederate artillery barrage did not help on the last day of the battle much. I mean, right? So the idea of using extremely precise artillery fire in real time, in which you can see exactly what's happening, and that you have to multiply that by thousands of different types of devices out there now that are being used by forces, so that the force can sit down. They know exactly where the friendlies are. They know exactly where there's contact along the line, and they can see in real time all the things that are happening. So it's almost like having, if you ever played one of those kind of, military style video games where you get to move units around or something, it's almost like having that ability to look down as if you're God and see everything. The way in actual, historically in war, the big problem once you have contact with the enemy is you don't see anything. Everything becomes a bit of a chaos. You don't know where your soldiers are. You don't know where the enemy is. It's very difficult for commanders to try to figure all that out. And historically, they were using, different methods. They'd have runners, or they'd have a radio operators like in Vietnam or something. But, it was incredibly difficult, I think. So, harnessing all this technology is interesting. Israel's using a lot of new types of drones on the battlefield, as you can imagine, which is something we obviously see in Ukraine. What Israel's trying to do is use, much more robust versions of these quadcopters and types of things that can be used to drop munitions, or can be used to scout locations and get a sense of what's going on. So those are some of the interesting technologies we've seen. Israel's trying to plow a lot of money into laser air defenses, which are not quite there yet. But I think a lot of the air defenses that Israel's using have had a big learning curve in this war in terms of shooting down things like drones. And Israel's air defenses have had to get a lot better. And I think it's been difficult, but I think they've, mostly succeeded. I mean, the home front did not take that many hits in the conflict. It took some. I guess I would point to some of those types of technology. Also, things like precision mortars, which Israel is now putting on. They put them on the back of a Humvee so that you have or you can put them on an old M113, which is interesting. Israel has thousands of these old APCs that are from the Vietnam era. So they've repackaged them to do all sorts of things. They use them as autonomous vehicles now in Gaza, basically giant robotic vehicles. And that's something that is, look, the M113 is not a great platform for that, but it's a learning curve in terms of how can you use autonomous robotic vehicles in kind of manned-unmanned teaming, which is something everyone's been talking about. But I think Israel's getting a sense of how it actually works in the real battlefield, what actually works, what doesn't work. And so I assume, lots of lessons will come out of this war in terms of how this new technology can bolster, the average battalion or platoon level, and what types of technology doesn't work, and what types of technology the guys actually want, because you can't give an infantryman every type of technology, because the infantry soldier just can't handle all of it, right? I mean, you don't want to flood this person with too much information. It will drive them nuts, and they won't have situational awareness. So it's kind of a matter of trying to figure out what is the best stuff to put in the hands of these guys.
One of the things that's dear to my heart is doctrine. It's something I read a lot about. In your book, you describe something called the momentum doctrine, although you do say that it wasn't followed. So I was hoping you could tell us something about what you know about the momentum doctrine, and then also, what happened instead? Was it applied? Was it not applied?
Well, the momentum doctrine came out several years ago in terms of the IDF thinking. The idea was to, create a new doctrine, and the IDF wanted to look at, okay, here are the threats we might face, and here's how we want to deal with that. So the IDF talks about how Hamas and Hezbollah have become these kind of hybrid rocket, armies that have massive amounts of munitions that they can fire from long ranges at Israel into Israel's home front, especially, which is not, not acceptable from Israeli society point of view. At least historically was not, that it would be under missile attack for weeks or months on end. Although in this war, obviously, we saw is actually the home front of Israel was under missile threat for 15 months. So all of the ideas actually presented in the momentum doctrine of, well, we need to neutralize these threats very quickly because we can't allow this to happen for a long period of time. I think those assumptions went out the window pretty quickly in terms of this is not going to be a fast war. The other thing that momentum seems to try to do was to try to harness all this new technology and also push the technology down, as I mentioned, like platoon and battalion level, and also to have everyone on the same page. So, in the old days, the Air Force and the Navy and the Army, these were different organizations, right? So the idea that an infantryman would know what the pilots are doing or what the ships are doing, I mean, maybe that would be known at a division level or brigade level, right? That commander might be able to be in touch physically with his or her counterpart in the Navy or in the Air Force. But the idea that, at lower levels, everyone would see the same thing, I think was kind of unheard of. Concept of momentum, my sense of it was, to push all of this information down so that everyone was kind of seeing the same battlefield, using similar interfaces. And, they talk about, closing circles of fire and stuff faster, which means, if I'm a soldier in the field and I see an enemy in a building, I can call in an airstrike much faster or tell someone that threat is there. And then it's not just a question of getting the right airstrike and the right artillery piece to hit the building. It's a question of using the exact right munition at the right time. So you're not just leveling the whole neighborhood because of some one guy with an RPG. I mean, why would you do that? You want to be efficient, you want to be fast, and you don't want to kill lots of people, you don't want lots of collateral damage, and you don't want to hurt friendly forces. So, my sense of momentum was to try to close it. It was always about making things more efficient, more fast, more effective on the battlefield, destroying the enemy's kind of command and control nodes and all this stuff, and destroying enemy capabilities a lot faster, without having to necessarily take over the enemy country or whatever, whether it's Lebanon or Gaza or whatever. So, when you read through it, it all sounds great because you're like, well, listen, there is a lot more technology now. Let's try to use all of it, including artificial intelligence and stuff like that you can plug in at different parts of the machine in terms of trying to figure out what things to go after and when. The problem that I saw in the actual conflict was, in the end of the day, this was still a very slow war in which you had to send in, big army units like infantry and tanks, and they had to go forward very slowly and methodically. And at the end of the day, there was a massive amount of destruction in Gaza, which if you kind of thought about using precision warfare and closing circles of fire and all this stuff, you shouldn't need to destroy whole neighborhoods and kind of and demolish them and bulldoze them because you should be moving so quickly and the enemy should be completely off balance. And you're so efficient and lethal and effective that the enemy kind of is being, hit with all these blows that they just can't withstand it and they just collapse under it. So when you read the idea of the way it's presented and then you look at what actually happened, you're like, wait, I don't understand. This looks a lot like the 2009 war that Israel fought. Yes, the casualties are less, but sometimes they're less actually because of the medevac abilities actually of Israel to get people out faster and save lives on the battlefield. So Israel cut down by the number of people that were wounded that actually died in the battlefield by, I don't know, I forgot the exact number, but it's a lot of people in terms of the number that actually were killed in action instead of actually just being severely wounded because of the medical capabilities. So that wasn't in momentum. You start to look at what actually happened and you wonder, how much different was this in 2009? I mean, yes, they were able to close circles of fire much faster. You said instead of sending in infantry into a building or something, yes, you are using precision birds and using drones and stuff. So there's all sorts of things you don't have to do the same way. But what is the end result? It's unclear to me how much the end result differs. And the whole point of these doctrines, I would think, is to get to a different result. So, and I thought a little bit about, other types of wars like the American experience in the first Gulf War in 91 against Saddam's army. The United States used all of its technology to just totally dismantle and destroy Saddam's giant conventional Soviet armed force and totally destroyed it. I mean, there was very few American casualties. I mean, I don't know if there's ever been a war that's so lopsided in terms of casualties. So if you want to talk about momentum and what I thought it would look like is like that 30-day campaign that the Americans waged in which it was like I think most of the campaign was an air war, and there was like 3 or 4 days of ground maneuver, and they
Hmm.
just absolutely demolished what was left of Saddam's army, and then they stopped and they left. And when you look at the war in Gaza, we're talking 15 months. I mean, it went on and on and on up until the Trump administration sent over an envoy to stop it. Otherwise, if Trump had not been elected, I'm sure it would still be going on without any clear end in sight. And that certainly isn't what Momentum said as a doctrine, which is, well, we'll fight for forever, and we have no idea where it will lead. That certainly was not what the doctrine said.
No, no, not at all. Well, what do you think explains the slowness and the almost more methodical nature of what you saw versus what the doctrine suggests should be?
I think they had not really ever thought about going back into Gaza, so they just talked about it, and they thought that Gaza could be solved with an air campaign or maybe some very, there was also this love of special forces that Israel got sucked into the way that the Americans and our
Hmm.
militaries did. Every Western military has been sucked into this adoration for tier one special forces and all sorts of little units with the total abandonment of the big army up until everyone understood from the war in Ukraine that, well, actually we need to invest in artillery, 155 millimeter munitions and all these things we thought we just like were something out of the dark ages, basically, from the way people talked about them. So,
Hmm.
look, I
So,
think
so it's
Israel
not it's
fought,
not quite
yeah.
that Israel used big army, which they did, because you mentioned that they sent in tanks and infantry, but rather because of their like almost the distraction of the special operation forces and the precision strikes that they hadn't really thought through how to use the big army.
I
Do I have
think
that
there
right?
was starving of resources in terms of that and that learning curve. And then, the problem with warfare, as you know, is you always train to fight the last war. So
Hmm.
Israel was training to fight things that it thought, we'll fight another 2017 round with Gaza or whatever. No one thought that they'd have to go in and send 5 divisions into Gaza. I just don't think anyone imagined it. So that was not on the table. And once they understood at the top level, October, 9th or 10th or whatever, when they were still counting the number of bodies and didn't know how many people were taken hostage because it was a total chaos. Once they understood we're going to have to go back in, they sat around for 2 weeks or so for retraining all the reservists to do urban combat fighting. And I remember going to watch this happen, and I was like, wait a sec, you guys haven't been training how to take a house or go into a building? I mean, really? None of these reservists were not ready, and they didn't want to lose them. And look, I think the commanding general staff has a bit of a McClellan complex. If you remember the Civil War general, McClellan was considered a great commander and some sort of a genius. And yes, I mean, they called him Little Napoleon or something.
Hmm.
Well, he didn't turn out to be a field genius. I mean, it turned out when they let him have the army that actually spent most of his time drilling it. He was much loved by his men, but he spent most of the time drilling the army. He didn't actually want to use it. And unfortunately, I think that Israel's commanding the top brass kind of wanted to do the same thing. They didn't want to have to send it into the cauldron of maelstrom of death that actually it would have to go into. So they were very cautious, and that's not obviously the way that IDF is supposed to historically be run, because the IDF is supposed to be the one that has the chutzpah and always willing to go first. And if you look at Israel's history, like 67 or the wars that Israel won, even in 73, when Israel lost on the first day or two, within several days, Israel took the initiative and was already moving forward across the canal. Whereas if you look at the war in October 7th, Israel took a very long time to seize the initiative. That allowed Hamas, it seems, to pick up the pieces again and again and again, and then continue to emerge. From Hamas's point of view, as long as they survive, they win. So
Hmm.
they were able to keep surviving.
Okay, we've got kind of the McClellan dilemma. How much of this is the casualty sensitivity, just sort of fear of getting one's own people killed?
Well, yeah, I mean, Israel, the IDF is certainly casualty sensitive. It tries to do everything possible to not send soldiers needlessly to their deaths. And then when they do get wounded, obviously getting them out and doing everything possible. I mean, the tragedy for Israel is that having invested so much in being casualty sensitive, then you have October 7th, where, it's one of the worst massacres in a single day in all of human history. I mean, it's unprecedented what happened on October 7th. So you have so much killing, actually. I think Israel then, I think there was a sense for a period of time during the war, because there were plenty of casualties, that life became a bit cheaper, actually. And I think that is not in the norm of the Israeli mentality.
Hmm.
But I think the IDF didn't suffer. It suffered casualties every day. I don't think it was totally afraid of doing that. I don't think that. I think it didn't know what it wanted to do in Gaza. It didn't know what victory looks like. It didn't have a clear political end game. And so the IDF kept handing off tactical goals to brigades and divisions and say, okay, why don't you go into Shujaiya or Jabalia and clear it out? And they would go in and they would clear out and then they would leave and then they go back into the same place and clear it again. You know, and I guess that's kind of what the Americans did in Iraq a bit from 2003 to 2011 or to some extent. I mean, there was going into certain areas and then going back. I don't know. But I think, again, historically, it doesn't seem to work, right? That's what also happened with Vietnam. U.S. units would go into places like, Nha Trang or whatever, An Son Valley or whatever. These guys would go into places like Hamburger Hill. They'd attack the place 9 times, then they'd leave, and there was no point to any of it. It doesn't seem there was a point to any of it if you look at it in the long run. So,
right. So there's no strategy here.
I haven't seen a strategy in terms of, and I am sure that if people were to ask, the blame would probably go uphill, which is the brigade commander would say, it's not my job to come up with a strategy. What about the division? Well, the division would say, well, it's the chief of staff. And the chief of staff would say, well, it's the prime minister. So I'm sure that the ball would just roll uphill in terms of trying to say, we're not sure what the goal here is. Now, the war has officially several goals. One goal is to just defeat Hamas capabilities. One is to defeat its governing ability, which I don't really know exactly how you define that, but that's one of the goals. And then another goal is, I think, to bring back the hostages, obviously. And then another goal, Gaza should not be a threat to Israel. I mean, that's kind of an amorphous goal. I mean, like, to my mind, it's very different than the Powell Doctrine in the 91 Gulf War, which is like, have really clear goals and then just get there and just stop. So it's not clear to me if I were to give you those goals, how would you measure whether you'd achieve them in Gaza? It's not an easy measure.
Right. So how do you connect the dots between achieving a limited objective, like go into that neighborhood, and the larger theory of victory? Like what's the connection? And I personally haven't seen any evidence that anybody actually did that connecting of the dots.
Well, it's not clear, but if you say, okay, we're trying to defeat the capabilities of Hamas, so then you say, okay, in each neighborhood, there are X number of capabilities, let's say. So you go into the neighborhood, you clear it out. Now, let's look at the Jabalia campaign, or Jabalia campaign that began in October and ended in January of 2025. So October 24. It was about a 3-month campaign, I think. They sent in an entire division in there with 3 or 4 brigades of infantry and tanks. And they went into northern Gaza. They initially went in very quickly and kind of sealed it off. Then they found 70,000 civilians there. So then they had to evacuate them all. So they let the civilians leave. And then they spent 3 months or 2.5 months fighting terrorists, in which they claim they eliminated or detained 2,000 or 3,000 terrorists. So that's kind of, and so you look at those numbers and you say, okay, that has defeated terrorism in that area, and the capabilities of Hamas and Jabalia are reduced by 95%. I mean, that's the conclusion you could draw. And then what you had is a ceasefire, and 2 weeks later, Hamas paraded one of the Israeli women hostages in Jabalia, and then released her there. And then Hamas was nice enough to make a big banner during the release in which they had all the logos from all the IDF units that fought there, like the Armored Brigade, and I think they had Givati and Kafir. I mean, anyway, they had the logos for the infantry brigades. And each of them, they kind of redesigned the logo as if that brigade had been defeated. Like they think they put one of them as the logo has a fox on it, and they stuck a sword through the fox or something. So Hamas was very clearly conscious of the fact that the IDF had basically said, we went in here and destroyed this and defeated you. And Hamas was very clearly saying, well, no, you didn't. So now you can step back and say, yeah, but it's just a bunch of Hamas guys with AK-47s. It's like 30 guys. I mean, that's not exactly a victory picture. I mean, so you can draw your own conclusions about whether that was successful or not. Certainly, the story of Hamas governing abilities. I mean, it can't govern the place if no one lives there, I guess. But how quickly will Hamas regrow its tentacles in that area, and how quickly will it return to governance? I assume it already has returned to quote unquote governance. I mean, I don't know what
kind of looks like
Hamas it. Yeah. So, I mean, it's a question of how you measure what is Hamas as a government. I mean, it's a government. But anyway, the point is that I think it's hard. I think it's hard to get to the end zone with those goals, and it's not entirely clear how you overwin. Now, some people would just say, "Well, Seth, the concept of winning is a stupid idea. That's black and white. That's not how wars are won. That's not how things are fought these days. You never win." So, okay, I mean that's fine. That people can have that view.
You mentioned in your book several times that there was a strong reticence on the part of the IDF to actually stay anywhere, right? They would clear an area and then they
Right.
would leave, but then like nobody ever wanted
Yes.
to stay put to control, to hold the ground.
Well, I think that's also maybe a bit of part of this momentum concept, which is that controlling of the land apparently doesn't actually matter in warfare. I mean, it
Hmm.
doesn't lead to victory, supposedly. So your real goal is just to go in and destroy command and control nodes and all sorts of other things. I mean, look, again, as a person who I think I consider myself a bit of a student of military history, actually historically the way wars are won is you have to control the field at the end of the war, the end of the battle, and you have to control the defeat the enemy. I mean, the Confederacy was not defeated in the U.S. Civil War because at the end of every battle the Union left, which actually did happen at places like lots of the battles like Bull Run and Antietam. They were a complete draw, and both sides withdrew. But that's not how they won the war. They won the war by sending in General Grant to just totally destroy the Confederacy bit by bit, and they sent in Sherman to march to the sea and just destroy everything that was there until the thing had totally collapsed. That's also how Nazi Germany was defeated. So I think the way that IDF, again, that was Lincoln who decided to do that. It's not that like it's the commander of the IDF is not responsible for what they're supposed to do on the battlefield, but the commander is given a set of objectives. The IDF did not want to go into Gaza and run civilian affairs. It didn't view itself as doing that. Now, that's a difference than the IDF, many decades ago when Israel did control Gaza and Israel did run civilian affairs. So, but the modern IDF doesn't view itself as wanting to occupy and run civilian affairs. That's why in the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority is supposed to deal with the other civilians, and Israel has the Kogat and other ways of dealing with things that are civil affairs. But Israel doesn't view itself as governing. So the IDF didn't want that task. And therefore, whenever the IDF went into a neighborhood, all the civilians were evacuated. I mean, it's a fascinating, that's also a kind of new way of warfare, because I think historically in war, a lot of times what would happen is you would overrun the enemy and you'd end up dealing with all the enemy civilians and they kind of just be in your rear and you just deal with them there, right?
Hmm.
I mean, when Wellington marched into France in 1815 or whatever, he didn't care about French civilians. He was there to fight Napoleon. It didn't matter if the civilians got in the way, then they had to be moved. But no one thought that you'd have to move all of them. When the IDF went into Gaza, all of the civilians were basically told to leave certain areas like northern Gaza and go somewhere else because the IDF did not want to deal with them. I guess it also knew that more of them would be killed, which is, of course, a humane way of fighting war. But again, it allows the enemy much more time to regroup. And then you end up in this kind of whack-a-mole strategy where you go into a neighborhood and then you leave. So the only enemy that you end up killing is the enemy that presents themselves to you in a sense,
Correct,
which
right.
is what the enemy Hamas ended up doing was very quickly going to ground. Hamas is estimated to have had 24 battalions at the beginning of the war, which I think it's kind of a nonsensical way to look at their structure, but whatever. They were supposed to have that many battalions. And very quickly, Hamas just split all those men up into like cells of like 3 or 4 guys. And they said, okay, take pot shots at the IDF, walk around in civilian clothes when you're not shooting at them, and see if you can survive. And that's what Hamas did. And so therefore, the IDF at some point was very rarely running into these guys. Every once in a while, they catch a bunch of them hiding out at like a school because Hamas was always hiding in schools and hospitals, and they'd be lucky enough to catch a bunch of them.
One thing I want to try to understand is the relationship between sort of the IDF's own reticence towards being responsible for civilians and sort of the higher level Israeli government's own reticence to think about governing or to think about creating a replacement for Hamas, which of course might smack of uh, encouraging or taking steps towards a viable Palestinian state or something like that. In other words, I guess what I'm asking is there's the situation on the ground in which commanders, for lots of reasons, often very sound ones, are just reluctant to play the role of occupying government. And then at a much higher level, there's the Israeli government's own inability to think about or make any kind of decisions about the future of Gaza. But what is the relationship between the two? I mean, which is the one that really mattered in the end and sort of on the ground? Is it just the IDF commander's reluctance, or is it the fact that nobody was giving them clear messages from the top about, you got to do this?
No, my sense is it's the same problem that is so well known about the Vietnam War, which
Mm-hmm.
is the commanders were, I mean, I don't think the commanders were the problem. I think there were lots of skilled American commanders in Vietnam. I mean, Creighton Abrams and Westmoreland and all the lower and many of the lower level guys. I don't think if you read the memoirs about Vietnam, and I don't mean the some of the stuff about some of the units that went bad, but the units that were basically good. Most of the people that came out of Vietnam with lessons or wrote books about it, they blame the fact there wasn't really a political endgame or a political strategy. I don't think they necessarily think the tactics were all bad or that the commanders were responsible for where that war went. I think everyone assumes that the problem is at the top with LBJ or McNamara or Nixon or whoever. I mean, that there just wasn't clear. It wasn't clear where the war was going. So I get a sense with Israel that it's the same issue, right? Which is that the politicians didn't want to come up with a plan to remove Hamas. They wanted to reduce it by like 90%. And they didn't seem to want to replace it, because if they wanted to, then they would have tried to replace it, which as far as I can tell, there was never even like a trial run to
Mm-hmm.
replace it in even one neighborhood. I mean, which for me, I would say, listen, I agree it's hard to get rid of Hamas, but why don't we just try it? Why don't we do it in one place and see if it works?
Well, one of the interesting things about this conflict compared to other wars, though, is this whole problem about the large civilian population just that's there, like right in the middle of it all. And I know
Yes.
that you've written about Mosul and about
Yes.
how they were able to remove the civilian population
Yeah.
mostly. And I know I've written about Fallujah, where they very clearly kind of warned the civilians to leave and gave them the opportunity to leave, so that therefore it was almost like a free fire zone, which makes
Right.
things a lot easier. Of course, a lot of American soldiers and Marines got killed anyways, but it's still, you could blow stuff up without having to really worry about it. So how much of this was a factor? What do you see the Israelis doing in terms of managing this problem of, like, how do you fight a war amidst civilians? How do you minimize casualties while also, the reality is that it's going to happen?
Well, I think the Fallujah or the Mosul examples are good examples, and I meant Mosul is a perfect example, actually, how you win a war, which is the way that the Iraqis did it was there was ISIS was in Mosul, and there were thousands of ISIS members there, and Mosul is a big city. Mosul and its environs have at least 2 million people, which is similar to Gaza. And what the Iraqis did correctly and is that they were able to let most of the civilians move out slowly to IDP camps.
Hmm.
And then eventually there wasn't a lot of civilians left in Mosul. And then the Iraqis, it took them almost 9 or 10 months to take Mosul. It began in October, so a similar time frame in terms of the war in Gaza. It began in October 2016. By June, July 2017, it was all over, and ISIS had been whittled down to a few streets around that old mosque in Mosul, and the ISIS guys blew up the mosque, and then that was it for them. That was an incredibly successful campaign. ISIS was totally defeated, and afterward, the Iraqi government obviously went in there and began to administer it as a province or governorate again. Now, Gaza's much harder than that, because it's not that Israel wasn't going into Gaza so Israel could run it. I mean, they would have had to find a Palestinian or Arabs to run it, and so that's what makes it different than most. So maybe, yeah. I mean, it's difficult. There is a way to do it. I think removing the civilians is a pretty okay way, but the problem is that the enemy leaves as well, and then if you don't replace the enemy, then they come back, I think.
Hmm. I remember thinking at the time that what they needed to do was set up IDP camps on the outskirts of Gaza in order to try to do some of that. But of course, I don't think anybody ever considered that idea, and I certainly saw no evidence of it. And of course, in the politics of the region, then this becomes fraught, because now you're ethnic cleansing, or it's like all sorts of arguments made against getting people out of the way.
Well, that's right. So what happened in Gaza is that they asked the civilians to move to an area called Mawasi, which is in southern Gaza near the
Hmm.
ocean. Now, it's an interesting factoid of history that's the area that many of the Jewish communities were in 2005. That's why it's kind of open landscape, because it was Gush Katif, and they
Hmm.
removed most of the Jewish communities, and that kind of reverted to be an open area. But anyway, so the Gazans were moved there. I don't know. At some point, maybe 1 million of them moved there. The other civilians in Gaza just kept moving from place to place. So it's like in the central part of Gaza, most of the civilians never left, and then in northern Gaza, I think 70% left, but a bunch of them stayed behind, and they didn't actually ever leave Gaza City itself. So anyway, the thing is, the tragedy of how it worked was that Mawasi was always run by Hamas, basically. So they moved all the civilians from Hamas control to more Hamas control. And I think that's the worst of both worlds, because it would have been better to move them to some area of control by some other authority. Now, as you noted, Israel didn't want them to move to Israel, because imagine after October 7th telling Israelis, hey, you know what? We've just had October 7th. Now we're going to have 1 million Gazans come move to Israel as a reward. I mean, no Israeli would ever accept that, obviously. I mean, now the Egyptians didn't want them either. And I think Egypt's role here, by the way, has been pretty problematic in the sense that Egypt used to rule Gaza, and Egypt has always viewed Gaza as its kind of little like orphan area of influence. So the fact that the Egyptian intelligence didn't pick up on the October 7th, and after October 7th, the Egyptians did not seem to clearly condemn this, and they seem to be playing both sides of it. And I think their role has been, I think it seems very problematic. So therefore, they were not going to take in any Gazans, because the Egyptians also sensed, and probably maybe correctly, that if they take in hundreds of thousands of them, it will destabilize their state and the Sisi government, and it could create a situation in which Israel won't let them back, which then destabilizes Egypt more. And look how sensitive the Sisi government is after the fall of the Assad regime. They're very sensitive to any changes in their society. So I can kind of get it. But
yeah, I get
again, it leaves Gaza in an impossible situation. And because Israel's government didn't want to think up imaginative solutions like, okay, we're just gonna bite the bullet and we're gonna run Mawasi ourselves, and we'll send in Kogat, and we'll get funding from the West and the UAE to do this, and we'll run it, and then we'll replace Hamas with some civilian government authority there. Because Israel doesn't want the Palestinian Authority probably to run Gaza, so they knew that that's the only game in town, and therefore they said, no, we're not gonna invest in a bunch of civilian authority. We're gonna fight Hamas. We're good at that, and we're not actually good at civil governance. I mean, I think Israel knows that. It knows that Palestinians don't want to live under Israeli flags. Israel gets that. That's why Israel left. So that's the situation.
Hardly a good situation. Creating a power vacuum, but not being willing to fill it, knowing that nobody else is going to fill it, right? And then you have to ask, well, how is that at all aligned with the ostensible goals of the war, which is removing Hamas? I mean, obviously it's not. It's kind of self-defeating.
That's a good big question, because you and I may see it that way. But if we were to sit down in an off-record briefing in a quiet room with some of the people in charge of Israel's governing coalition, remember, Israel's not. It's Benjamin Netanyahu, but he has a very complicated, weird coalition of Haredi parties whose men don't even serve in the military, which isn't the best way to run a war. The worst war in Israel's history in terms of needing more people,
right?
Having the people in the government who actually don't want to serve, which isn't very helpful. Then you have the National Religious Party and Ben Gvir and the religious right, who some of whom actually want to return and occupy or send Jewish settlers back to Gaza. Some of whom don't want to do that, but their view is that the Palestinian Authority is much worse than Hamas. So their view is, listen, Hamas is bad. We sure as heck won't work with the Palestinian Authority. And then you have other members of the government, which are just like the rest of Likud or whatever, who are also quite suspicious of the Palestinian Authority, and also spent the last decade and a half basically saying, listen, it's okay if Hamas is in Gaza as long as they're contained. I think, in the end of the day, there's voices there that presented with the difficulties of this would say, listen, the best case scenario here is we fight and defeat Hamas in a few months, and then we kind of leave and let them return, but they'll be much weaker. And then we'll just do it again in a few years. And that's a cynical reading of things, but unfortunately, I think there's some people that kind of think that's kind of the best of a bunch of worse options.
Isn't that what they've been doing for the last 20 years?
Yes, but some of them probably think it works. I mean, I think that's the real question here. A lot of people think that mowing the grass works. They think the way that Israel runs the West Bank works. They would call it a success story. So it's a question is two people can look at the exact same thing, And one of them says, oh, no, this is a disaster. And one person says, no, this looks great. So I think it's, it's the jury is out. But I think that if you understand the way some of the strategists think, or some of the people in charge think, they think this is all kind of works. And they would acknowledge that October 7th is itself a disaster, but they would then say, we shouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Right.
It reminds me of that funny, weird scene in Dr. Strangelove, where they're discussing the order that allows the guy to launch all the bombers to take the Soviet Union and not be able to call them back.
Mm-hmm.
And the president says something like, well, I can't believe I approved that. And the general says, well, listen, this minor mistake should not be a reason to call into question the entire program.
Right.
So I don't know. I mean, I think unfortunately, I just think that, there's a whole lot of people, certainly people that are in the governing coalition now in Israel, that think that the Palestinian Authority, they view it as a much bigger existential threat to the future of Israel, and under no circumstances do they want it running Gaza, because otherwise they would have wanted it to run Gaza, over the last 15 years, rather than have to deal with the disaster that is Hamas.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Now, if you were to write a lessons learned study, you kind of do this a little bit at the end of your book, but if you were to write a lessons learned study, both for either for the IDF or really anyone else who's interested, what would you include in your lessons learned?
I guess I think the biggest lesson, I assume, is you don't want these war to happen in the first place. So you need to have skepticism within any big institution. So you need to, I think, drill into people at the top that they should never all assume the same thing. And if you have an entire room full of people at a national security level or whatever, and they all kind of think the same thing, they should always be willing to say, okay, you know what, let's take a step back. Let's do a red team analysis on this and pretend that we're all wrong. What if we're all wrong? And that's, look, it's not easy to be the voice that says, what if we're wrong? I mean, I remember before Putin's invasion of Ukraine, the Biden administration was saying, oh, Putin's going to invade Ukraine. And, I'm a contrarian. I said, you know what? I don't think he'll invade Ukraine. He'll do something. I can't imagine him really attacking Kiev. I mean, with an armored column, that's never going to happen. I mean, I was totally wrong. So that's okay. People are wrong sometimes. Mm-hmm. But I think it's good not to underestimate. You never want to underestimate the enemy. So, and 9/11 is the same story, by the way. I remember before 9/11, we viewed the terrorists as kind of almost a police problem. I remember when they attacked the USS Cole or whatever, we sent the FBI over there or something to deal with it. It's like, yeah, man, the FBI deals with criminal investigations, but these people need the CIA on their ass. They need everyone else. So my sense is, first of all, the drill into intelligence services and everyone, that you need to have a lot more skepticism. If everyone thinks the same thing, you should realize you're not thinking right. Then I guess once you've gotten past that and not underestimating your enemies, that would be another one, obviously. I mean, always assuming the enemy is going to throw something at you that you didn't expect. If you look on that on the grand strategic level, like China or whatever, I mean, it should be the assumption that whatever China's cooking up is not something we know about. And by the way, the COVID disaster crisis that happened in 2019, 2020, that's another example where we totally underestimated what was about to happen. I'm not saying that the Chinese made it in a lab necessarily. It's a conspiracy. I'm saying you should assume, when you hear about a weird disease that showed up in 2019, you should assume the worst, and you should set off all your alarm bells, and you should not be sleeping at the wheel for 3 months while the Chinese tinker around in Wuhan and allow it to spread around the world. You should go totally crazy and decide, let's imagine the worst. Anyway, whatever. So I would say those are some lessons. Another lesson, obviously, is just this issue you face with the Army in general, whether you should invest in big units or special units or whatever. I mean, I think, again, Israel's probably going to move in the opposite direction and now do the opposite, which is invest in all these big units and kind of refight the October 7th. So that's okay, but you probably also don't want to make the mistake of always training for the last conflict. I think a big lesson as well is that precision weapons don't win wars. I think precision weapons are mostly very fancy and mostly a bunch of nonsense, which is that precision weapons are very good for tailored missions to take out high value targets. They don't win a war. They kill little things. They're very good at little stuff. So this whole thing of, let's replace artillery units with smart artillery so that we have a whole battery of the typical old Paladin weapon systems. Let's replace 6 of them with 1. It can do as much work. Well, you know what, sir? Listen, if you replace 6 vehicles with one vehicle, and then that one vehicle is destroyed by a $20 quadcopter drone, you've
Now you're
now
in trouble.
invested billion. Yeah, you've now invested billions of dollars in a system you no longer have. And now you have no artillery, sir. Let's not invest all of our eggs in one basket in terms of ridiculously expensive artillery and ridiculously expensive fighter planes. And let's not build lots of, more Bismarck battleships where it's a total waste of money and the whole thing doesn't actually, we all know from history that you invest too much in one thing, it ends up being a huge boondoggle. And actually existentially it could be a disaster. So that's another thing. I think air defense is another problem we've learned from this war. I saw that the United States now is going to invest in what they call, what Trump calls an Iron Dome for America, which is perfectly good to invest money in future threats. I think that's good. But air defense is not a substitute for strategy. You cannot just sit around and build lots of air defense systems like Israel did and think, okay, you know what? We have lots of air defenses. We can just sit around now and not worry about the enemy. Well, yeah, the thing about air defense systems is they're a lot like the Great Wall of China or the Maginot Line. It's lots of defenses, but defenses don't always work because the enemy will find a way around them. And then it's the same problem with the really expensive artillery piece. You've invested a massive amount in something that doesn't actually work. So again, you can't substitute defenses for having a strategy. You can't just build more and more walls.
It looked to me that the Israel security with Iron Dome, it just encouraged Israel to let Hamas take the initiative and have the initiative for the last 20 years.
That's exactly what it did. And it's just like the walls around Byzantium or any other story where you build something cool and then slowly and surely all the Roman legions watching the wall get fat and lazy and drunk. And then they get overrun by a bunch of savage Germanic tribes or whatever. I mean, history is just so full of this example of where people are so arrogant and so complacent, and they just think we have all this really smart technology or weapon systems or whatever. It's like Custer riding into the little bighorn and just not imagining that there were 10,000 Indians out there, and Custer thought his 200 troopers could defeat them, and yet they all got massacred. So history is just so full of stories like this, and I think we should stop. We should really learn the lessons. This doesn't mean you don't invest in Iron Dome. Iron Dome's great. I think it just means you don't allow it to become the sine qua non of your kind of defense establishment, in the sense that it's just a tool. Use it like a hammer and a nail. Don't just pretend that the hammer and the nail now is the house. It's just a bloody tool. So that's where I would say we should walk away from this with that lesson. And I think Israel has learned. Look, Israel's learned a lot of lessons the really, really, really hard way, I think. And look, in terms of air defense systems, look, the Houthis were still attacking Israel up until the ceasefire, and the Houthis were not deterred, by the way, by lots of fancy air raids and bombing of the Hodeidah port, which didn't work. In my view, I don't think it worked. So
I can't imagine that it would. I really don't.
Yeah, why would bombing a port work when the Houthis, by the way, didn't even have Hodeidah port for the whole war? So why do they care about it? I mean,
right.
Anyway, the point is that they were still launching ballistic missiles at Ben Gurion Airport, which had the effect, by the way, since the beginning of the war, of having almost all the major Western or American airlines cancel flights to Israel, which is unheard of. I mean, Israel in the 67 or 73 war, I don't think had that happen. So it's totally crazy that commercial flights were not flying to Israel for 15 months. And everyone in Israel thought, well, that's okay. I mean, because most of them didn't have time to think about it because they were all in the reserves. But I mean, to be honest, that turned Israel almost into Ukraine, in the sense that Ukraine, I think, doesn't have commercial flights since the Russian attack, right? So, and I don't look. Israel's a high-functioning, Western style modern state. The idea that commercial flights don't fly to your country when you have the best air defense systems in the world, I'm in my view heavily problematic, and I don't think it's been discussed enough in Israel, because that discussion would lead places that we don't want to get to, which is, well, wait a sec, how is it that Hamas, a not very big terrorist organization, was able to bring the flights to Ben Gurion Airport to a halt?
Well, Seth, thank you. I think or certainly you've answered all the questions I wanted to cover, and I think that really works. So thank you very much, Seth, for joining me. I found this absolutely fascinating, and I certainly hope whoever watches this will think the same thing. And also, to those of you watching, please, again, check out Seth's book. And as I said before, there's a link to it in the description and also in the comments below. And his book has my enthusiastic endorsement. And of course, if you watch this far, please like and subscribe for this video. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you on my next video. Thank you.
Thank you.